But thank you, everybody, for joining today with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill now officially passed into law on November 15th, which actually feels like an eternity ago. Agencies are beginning to submit their applications in pursuit of this available funding. There are many different types of funding available, and we are going to dive into them today. There's many different timelines, milestones, and details to potentially get lost in. We're here to help you avoid that. In this session, we are going to discuss the different types of funding available and what actions agencies need to take to best position themselves for a successful bid. If you've been following or paying attention to the White House's communications on this topic, the White House actually put out a bipartisan infrastructure guide. I want to say 2 to 3 months ago, 8 to 12 weeks, somewhere in that memory time. They detailed each of the different types of grants and funding available. We're going to dive into all of that today. A couple of quick notes just before we get started. Number one, this is going to be an informal sort of conversational format. We want you to ask questions. So as we discuss things, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We will get to them at the end, time permitted. Don't wait, because typically we do get a lot of questions. So feel free to ask them in real time. Perfect. So with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and actually introduce our guests who are going to be speaking today. We have Chris Bell, who is the Vice President of Industry Strategy of the Trimble Owner and Public Sector. And then we have Rick Niederstadt, the Capital Program Support Manager of the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewer District. Before we jump in, Chris, I'm going to have you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and then Rick, I will have you follow him up.
Sure. Well, hey, thank you, Evan, for having us on the call today. We're super excited. My name is Chris Bell, and I look after industry strategy for our Trimble Owner and Public Sector organization within the wider Trimble organization. And this session is really exciting because there's a lot of fast moving news and new resources that really open up that sort of picture. So thanks for having me, Evan.
Yeah, and I'm Rick Niederstadt, Capital Program Support Manager at the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. Happy to be here. I'm an owner, just like most of you listening in here on the virtual summit. So in addition to sharing some of the information that we've been able to find regarding funding and the infrastructure law, I'll also be curious to hear some of the questions and hear about everything that other owners are having to deal with as well.
Perfect. Well, let's go ahead and jump right in. Let's do a status check with you, Rick. It has been a busy 6-7 months. Really, the past couple of years have been kind of bolting towards this position. I know, a bipartisan legislative goal towards investment in infrastructure has been on political deck in the halls of Congress for several years now. Well, now it's reality. Like I said, the bill passed on November 15th, 2021. What have you guys received in terms of communication, messages from the federal government, different resources available? As an owner, what types of things are you guys hearing?
Well, I think first and foremost, like a lot of the owners, and we are primarily a wastewater entity. So the majority of our capital improvement program is around water reclamation, conveyance. We do some flood management, but clearly, like everybody else, we've heard that the bipartisan infrastructure law is out there. Lots of funding is available, and within that guidebook you referenced, right? You can very easily find that for our sector, there's I think $55 billion in funding allocated to the water sector, right? So at a high level, much like everybody else, we're hearing that funding is out there, but there's still a high level of uncertainty with respect to the details of that funding, right? And we've gotten a little bit more involved with our state agencies to understand that funding, at least in the state of Wisconsin, for the water sector will be coming through the state revolving fund loans. So on the wastewater side, that's the Clean Water Fund Loan Program. drinking water is a different side. But so we know that funding will be coming through that program. We are already a part of that program. We've been using it for years. But the details of that are still pretty sketchy. We understand that there will be some principal forgiveness involved in that program, but we don't yet have any real details on that. So I think in about 2 weeks, I think we are meeting with the State Department of Natural Resources, as well as some of our other larger wastewater utilities in the state to talk about some more of those details, right? What are the requirements going to be? What projects might qualify? Is there a, what kind of disadvantaged community component to this will be under consideration, so on and so forth. So I think in a word, I would say uncertainty still on the details, but we certainly know that funding is available and will be trickling down in the near term.
Chris, it feels like you're having a new conversation with owners every single day. Do you have anything to add to what Rick is hearing in the market?
I do, and we hear that perspective often. It really depends on the sector of infrastructure you're currently working in. So many organizations have different stories. Sometimes we talk to owners and they say, oh my goodness, we have an explosion of projects. We have a lot of things kicking off. And other organizations share Rick's perspective, which is, hey, we're cautiously optimistic about the opportunity for more funding, and we're preparing our organizations to take on those, but we've not seen the check clear in our bank yet, so we haven't released those projects. So the perspective that I would share with those that are on the call is that your picture of the funding flow will definitely depend based upon the project type and the funding source that you have. What you're looking at here on this slide is actually a snippet that comes from whitehouse.gov. If you go to whitehouse.gov or if you go to GSA, they're in both locations. But this particular picture is an interactive dashboard that talks about all of the releases of funds that have come through the bipartisan infrastructure law. In this picture, it's if you look up the 6-month status, it's a status check. It was actually released in the 2nd of May, I believe. And what you're seeing here is the actual dollar value of bipartisan infrastructure law funding sources that have been released by state. And actually, if you drill into each of those states, this is an interactive map. You can click in on the state, and what you'll find is a list of the types of projects that are underneath it. So you'll see here, I know it's very small, but in large states like Texas, $8.1 billion. I happen to live in North Carolina, $2.2 billion are examples of funds that have been released. Now, before we share the next slide, I do want to mention is that we're just speaking today of the picture of the bipartisan infrastructure law. There have been many funding sources that have already taken place, including state and local relief funds, as well as the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Those would have released dollars for certain types of projects in response to COVID and pandemic measures, as well as in particular in potable water, lead line replacement, and others. Those projects have released. Now, this map is really important because this is the next set of data, and you should be able to see more and more of this. When you drill down into these dots, each of these dots is a release of funds for a specific project. So you can actually interact with this map today in your state, in your county, in your municipality, and find out about projects that are being done. Now, when you drill into the data, what you will find is that the projects that are listed here are predominantly those of transportation. So you will see a lot of DOT project work. You'll see a lot of bridge repair and replacement related work, because those were the first flow of dollars when the FAST Act reauthorization was really replaced with this bipartisan infrastructure law. So there was a release. So airports, bridges, roadways, highways are the majority, but that will change over time.
Rick, I know you sort of touched on this lightly, but from an owner's perspective in Milwaukee, what is your agency's expectation that funding will start flowing for your organization?
Well, that's a good question, Evan, and I think I think I got the answer to that looking at the resources that are available in the guidebook. Relative to our entity, right? As mentioned, we'll be getting any of our funds through the state revolving fund, and it looked like the next release of funds through that program is supposed to be September of 2022. So we'll hopefully get some more details on what sorts of projects they might be looking at from that perspective in our meeting in a couple of weeks. And then obviously we have a pretty significant capital improvement builder to be able to mine that system to see if there are particular requirements for projects that are likely to be funded through the program. Which of our projects might meet those requirements. So hopefully by Q3 of this year, we'll have a lot more information than we have right now.
Thanks for that insight. So the next when we collected some of the topics and conversation starter points that owners were interested in and had questions about and were confused about in preparing for this session, one of the topics that we were asked to dive into was the different types of grants available. So if you dive into the White House Bipartisan Infrastructure Guide, that is a mouthful. If you dive into that guide and you look at the different allocations, the different funding grants available, there are many different types. There's competitive, formula-based, there's a few others, but I'm going to ask Chris for you to dive into those and hopefully be able to explain some of the nuances and differences between them.
Sure, happy to, Evan. If you could just bring up the slide funding mechanisms, I think that'll help the audience. So when you're looking at funding opportunities, first of all, one of the best places for you to go is to, and write this down, grants.gov. That's a really important URL. If you don't already know it, this is one of the biggest things. I actually think it happened during the Obama administration, is that there were all these grants, but they became somewhat inaccessible because no one knew about them. And so the government has done a lot of work in making sure that they've centralized and distributed information around grants. So grants.gov is one of those portals that will give you access to all of those grants. And so when you look at grants.gov, you can search by grants or cooperative agreements. And basically, if you think about grants and cooperative agreements, the whole point of those is to transfer value from the federal government to state, local, and private organizations. But they differ in how they're implemented and the conditions that are applied. So let's go over to the grants section of this picture here. Grants are the awarding agency, and it has a monitoring and oversight role. Oftentimes a state Department of Transportation or other is going to play some sort of oversight role associated with the projects that will happen under the Department of Transportation. But some will have a hands-off approach. And they'll allow the dollars to sort of flow, and they're monitoring and oversight, but the execution of that work is really done by the local governing authority. With cooperative agreements, that's really different, is that the staff of the awarding agencies are really substantially involved in the actual project, and their expectation is to work side by side with the recipient agency. So on grants.gov, of the available grants that have been released or are pending to release, you will see information about those two, grants or cooperative agreements. So when you think about the grants themselves, there are also two levels of distribution of those funds. One is considered discretionary. You might also call that competitive. It is an application process for a grant. Let me stop there and say This is really important. If you're unfamiliar with that whole process is, yes, it is in your hands as the public agency to apply for a grant. If there's grant dollars available to you and you do not apply, you will not receive those grants. They are made available for those that ask. And so it's important for you, if you have aspirations within your organization, to modernize, as an example, your project management capabilities, your asset management capabilities, and you need technology. There are specific grants that are available that you must apply for, and you may actually receive federal funds for those, but you have to apply. Now, the other side of the equation of those grants are formula or formulaic grants. And those are really distributed either based on population or some other criteria. An example of this is that if I looked at it, and this is just the Chris Bell trend analysis of the funding source, it seemed like bridges really came through pretty quick. That was the first tranche of dollars released. Roads, bridges were the focus. Then the next set was the formulaic grant of airports. So if you actually search on Google and you said, where are the grants for airports, you'll find it listed by every single airport in the United States. It gives an exact to the penny amount of funding that was made available for each and every airport. Now, those airports have those funds available, provided that they apply those funds to infrastructure improvement and improving the maintenance of their assets. Those are all allowable expenses. And those were based on the size of the airport. So if you're a large airport like Atlanta Hartsfield or Charlotte Douglas Airport or LAX, you received a larger amount than the local or municipal airport or airfield in your area. But that was formulaic and distributed based upon size. Now, one of the most important things you could see from the interactive map and from cooperative agreements that's happening, there are more people involved. And for the current administration, the priorities for grants and the funding is to create good paying jobs, supporting disadvantaged and underserved communities, and implementing ideas of social equity and environmental justice, and encouraging projects that promote climate resilience and sustainability. Those tend to be what's available today and what you can apply for. That's been a little bit of a mystery, but the starting point for you is grants.gov.
So, Chris, I'm actually going to jump in with a question from the audience because I think this is relevant. One owner asks out of Wisconsin, can entities apply for more than one bipartisan infrastructure law funding opportunity?
Yes.
Can they apply for multiple grants?
Yeah, so it depends upon your organization. So I would say by and large, the answer is yes. Is if you are a municipal government or a county government or a city government, you're going to have all different types of projects. So I can imagine you would have lead line replacement. You would have safety related projects on the transportation side. You might have some expansion that you would have to do for governmental services that you offer. 3 different types: a road, a building, and a utility related work. Different grants for each of those projects. You can apply to all of them.
Perfect. Continue to ask questions, by the way. As a reminder, we're just going to go through them as they come up. The next question that we're going to dive into is what sorts of resources are available for state and local agencies. Chris, I think I'm going to hand this one off to you first, and then I'm going to let Rick follow up.
Yeah, and before we get to the resources question, let's talk a little bit about flow. And if I could just toss something over to Rick here for a second, Evan, is if you'll bring up the next slide that we have about the federal funding flow. What you have from a flow perspective, and I think this is how you can set your expectation, and it really is right in alignment with what Rick had shared with us here, is that the first round of of information sounded very big, right? It's these big $1.2 trillion. It almost felt intangible as to having that cautious optimism. And so the grant makers, the federal funders, are the ones that were sort of in the know of all of that and were preparing information. And then as those go out, the prime recipients at the state level and certain local governments are starting to get that round of flow. And May was a really important month. Those dollars started to flow in May. We expect with the fiscal year changing in June, a lot for local governments and departments of transportation and others. That's going to be a really big triggering time of making great ideas become very real, right? They now get put into a budget. They get banked upon. Money gets deposited. And we're seeing that. If you just look on the news and look up, whoever you trust, Engineering News Record, Associated General Contractors, ABC, whoever, Dodge, all of those organizations have started sharing news of new projects getting kicked off and released. Now, as we move through June and into the next month, you've got new fiscal budgets that are starting to happen and some obligations that need to be done under the federal budget timeline, which is September. So you have to have obligated a certain amount of these dollars to start the flow. So between June and September is a critical month or a critical time period of funding release. And I think that's what Rick mentioned. And Rick, could you add a little color to that? It's like you could feel it starting to gear up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we certainly can feel it starting to gear up, and I think that's why we have a meeting with our regulators in 2 weeks to get more information on and what does that gearing up look like, and what is that going to mean for our organization. And I think, Chris, to your point, there's some critical months coming up, and for those owners that maybe have received a lot of information from their entities that regulate them or entities that fund them, that's great. And I think for those owners that maybe haven't, I think proactivity is the name of the game here. Don't wait to receive information telling you what's going to happen. Make some contacts with those individuals and those entities to try and get ahead of it, right? What information am I going to need to be successful in getting any funding that's available, rather than just waiting to hear that, yay, I did get some funding, or no, I didn't, right? Put yourself in the best position that you can be to be a recipient of funding that is available.
We are going to go ahead and dive into these resources. I'm really excited for this personally because I think this is super valuable. And Chris, I'll hand this off to you.
Yeah, so resources and a lot of good questions. So if you have that thought that says, hey, I might be in project management, or I might be in asset management, or I might be in early capital planning or design phase, and I'm not really involved in this process. One is pretty consistent feedback is you kind of have to go to the very top of your organization. We find that executive directors, chief engineers, the top of the organization tend to be the ones that are most in the know in terms of timing, what resources may be available, and it may not have just cascaded yet to you. So it is important, engage your executive directors, ask questions. You should come with your wish list of projects and other things that you would do. If you had additional funding resources, what would be your priorities? You should definitely develop a picture of that. And these resources that we have available for you are one of the ways that you can do that. So as we mentioned, grants.gov, definitely a great starting point. Be proactive, go through that, take a look at funding available. I'll tell you, your administration would love the fact that if you came up with a really great idea and said, hey, we've heard a lot about digital transformation and we want to get started doing that. And by the way, here's a funding source and it could be free to us. Boy, I mean, I'll tell you what, as a leader, I would love people coming into a management meeting, sharing an opportunity that would be zero cost to our organization. But once you register into these sites, you'll be able to receive email alerts, and anytime there's newly uploaded grant opportunities within the parameters that you've applied, that will keep you then in a sort of a passively updated mode for all of that information. So we certainly encourage you to do that. Also, there are additional resources that you can get after initial program announcements. And there is you'll have to make sure that you have a unique entity identified, or UEI, through sam.gov. That establishes your entity within the organization, and that'll process this stuff. So you're going to want to do that upfront, and that'll make a whole lot easier for the application process. So when you apply for the grants. Now, these other resources, there'll be links. We're going to ship this out to you so you have it. Grants 101 is one of the ways that will allow you to get a great overview of the discretionary funding process, and you'll better understand the whole life cycle of the process, and that'll provide some education. Federal agency websites that we have there, Department of Transportation programs and grants pages, upcoming notice of funding opportunities. These tend to be on the transportation side of the equation, and your funding agency, the whole bipartisan infrastructure law will use the existing funding mechanisms that you already have in place. They're not net new creation funding sources. So those same organizations that you learn to trust, they are developing capabilities similar to what the Departments of Transportation have done for that. So those are great resources. We'll post them on our website. We'll send them to you through the slides that will get you links to this stuff. And there'll be more that come out along the way.
Rick, with these resources in mind, what sorts of resources or industry connections are you guys leveraging to help navigate your agency through this process?
Yeah, well, so, Chris just mentioned that not a lot of the programs here are new, right? The funding is new, but the the programs themselves have existed in many cases for lots of years, right? So hopefully, at least in our case, we have lots of connections with the various entities that have been running these funding sources for years, right? So we're leveraging those existing connections, whether it be through the state revolving loan fund, or we use lots of other programs. We work with the Army Corps of Engineers. We work, I think last year or 2 years ago, we started working on WIFIA loans, which are Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation loans, right? So I think ultimately, in the best case scenario, right, you don't have to make a lot of new connections. You have to leverage the existing connections that you've had to get a variety of funding in the past, perhaps not associated with the bipartisan infrastructure law, but for other, funding mechanisms in the past. If you do have to make new connections, by all means, go ahead and do it. But again, at the highest level of the organization, right, our executive director has lots of connections. We've been working with our congressmen and women in the state relative to this and other funding. So, leverage the connections that you have, solicit information on, what sorts of locations can I access that funding, and, make that information available to you and use it.
So when we talk about owners positioning themselves to be in the best position to receive a successful bid for one of these grants or funding sources, one of the most, I feel personally, underrated aspects that isn't talked about enough is the social equity, climate crisis, environmental protection elements that are of priority in this law. Up on the screen, as you can see, this was the White House guide that is, I think, 496 pages in length that was published 8 to 12 weeks ago. And in this guide is a direct letter from the implementation coordinator of the Biden administration. The implementation coordinator is obviously in charge of managing and distributing and communicating how these funds are going to be accessed. Like I said, one of the biggest areas that is underrated and completely glanced over is those three areas of climate crisis, environmental protection, and social equity as priorities. In that guide and in that letter, the implementation coordinator actually specifically speaks to how projects with those priorities in mind will literally be moved to the front of the queue as prioritized projects to receive federal funding. We're going to sit on this topic for a little bit. Chris, why don't you talk about how agencies can best position themselves to prioritize those elements within their projects?
Yeah, Evan, we've run a couple of series and educational webinars about this process, and the first stage was really about get informed, right? Is you wanted to get smart about all of the different funding sources that were out there, and I think people are still ramping up. These additional resources that you show here are really useful resources. This White House Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Guidebook, I recognize that it's very long, and you say, oh my goodness, how can I put myself to sleep tonight? I'm going to read the guidebook. But I'll tell you, you don't have to read every page. You can get right to the areas that are your type of assets that you create, and you're going to learn a lot. And one of the things that it really gets down to is on the competitive grant writing process, or the term that we use, discretionary. You are writing a narrative during an application process for the project, for the funding that you're seeking. It's important to get help. So one of the things that some organizations do is they team up with their local engineering firm or their program management firm, or whoever assists them on capital program management. And they're going after a grant. So don't let your vendors or your resources or your teammates go on this one. Team up with them to help develop that narrative about your project. Touch upon those key values. And Evan's absolutely right. I personally would not submit a grant proposal if I wasn't clear about the job creation opportunities, the environmental sustainability, and the social equity that's required of the job. You should speak to that. If you just go nuts and bolts on the engineering need of your asset, that's one perspective, and that has merit. I'm not discounting that, but if you want that little X factor on the competition side, it's important to communicate that. And sometimes those resources don't exist within your organization, so you can reach out. One of the things that Trimble has done is that we have someone on staff that actually helps strategically navigate the grant programs and the availability. And actually, she is a professional grant writer and proposal professional. And so we even team up with some of our clients to help them navigate this process and offer our own services to help you acquire the funding that you need for taking care of your capital improvement program. But Rick, you've been through a lot of these, before in the past. Any other sort of tips and tricks?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly, I think a lot of it comes down to knowing what's going on in your community, right? A lot of the items that you mentioned, Chris, social equity component, right? There was just an article in our paper today about the federal government provided $2 million of funding to a local entity called Employ Milwaukee, right? Intent on, increasing the workforce in the water sector here. Milwaukee Water has a pretty significant vacancy rate. They're having trouble getting employees, right? So as you talk about writing, grant proposals to get projects, right? Maybe it's worth reaching out to somebody like Employ Milwaukee in our area to say, all right, we have these projects. We know these projects are perhaps in a disadvantaged community. That's where the infrastructure is going to be delivered. Are we able to pair up with anything with Employ Milwaukee to make that part of a grant proposal, right? So, understand what's going on in your community. Don't just have tunnel vision relative to your particular entity, because there are other resources out there that, one, may be able to help you, and two, may be able to make a grant proposal look a whole lot better than it would have otherwise.
Rick, if I could just pile on in a real world story, we just happened to be talking with a larger transportation organization, and one of the things that they found out is just even internally within their staff, they had a lot of folks that were at the retirement age. They certainly call it a graying of the workforce. But it's very real, right? And I know we're going to have a chance to talk a little bit about the impact of the graying of the workforce. But you have individuals, public sector is also, open and vulnerable to the same thing as the private sector in terms of the great resignation that people always talk about. And here's the deal. Is that you're losing, valuable resources within your organization, and you definitely need more people that are knowledgeable and skilled. Grant proposals that find a way to partner with the community to create jobs and then train people to become skilled laborers in that area, or to learn a skill or trade that puts them to work on your project and then gives them a lifelong skill. Wow, you're making a positive impact on your social equity, in your economic impact and long-term sustainability. So those are really great ways to bolster your chances when you're applying for the grants.
Yeah, absolutely. And other things that some of these owner organizations might already be doing that they perhaps wouldn't think about including in a grant proposal, right? Any disadvantaged business enterprise programs that you have in place, any apprenticeship utilization programs that you have in place for contracts, things like that. It's basically putting a resume out there, right? How do you want to get hired? You want your project to get picked, right? Put whatever information into that grant proposal that will make it look better than the other ones. Using things that perhaps you wouldn't ordinarily consider, right? It's not just technical. It's especially related to the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's a lot of social equity component to it, and there are a lot of programs out there, in some cases internal to your organization, in some cases external to your organization, that can be very helpful and very productive in that regard.
I want to leave a little bit of time for questions because we have 2 to 3 we got to get through. So I'm going to keep us moving along. But I know this whole conversation has set us up for a tipping point. And Chris, this is where I'm going to hand it off to you. But we know that this funding is going to become available. If you look at the Bipartisan Infrastructure White House Guide, you see Q2, Q3, Q4 of 2022 as major milestones for when many of these grants open up. I think the prevailing question we want to answer in this session is, what can agencies do now? What can they do now to best position themselves for this massive, sudden injection of federal funds? And Chris, I'll hand it to you.
Sure. And perhaps this slide does a really good job of communicating the sort of cascading impact. And one of the things that I would want you to understand, first of all, you're on this call. You're probably on the top 10% already of progressive organizations that are thinking about the impact of the funding to your organization. If you work on new construction, you're thinking about, hey, is this more projects? If you're on the asset management side, you're thinking, how can we rapidly maintain, repair, or queue up replacement of existing assets that we have? Rick, who's on this call, I got to just tell you, I admire him his leadership and the organization, because he saw this coming a long time ago. And they thought, we have to find ways to work smarter, more efficiently, more productive, to get things done. So, Rick's on this call because he represents leadership in digital transformation. But here's the conversation we have with so many agencies across the United States right now. So you have this condition where you have $1.2 trillion of new funding that's coming through. And yes, I recognize that a lot of that, if the first phase felt like transportation, but believe me, it doesn't matter what corner of infrastructure you're responsible for, you're going to have a moment. And according to a recent study that was conducted by Dodge Construction Network, they found that 85% of owners are right now expecting increases in project volume. And in fact, some of them significant increases in project volume. We're seeing that. And again, the first tranche coming through, $40 billion in bridge repair and replacement. There isn't a single, organization that's in the transportation side that isn't out there surveying their bridges conditions right now. Now, there is an expectation of tracking and reporting, in fact, an unprecedented one. We opened this call with a public portal that shows you every funding dollar and every project that's been going. That's a new level of transparency expected through the Office of Management and Budget. And they're going to be expecting to understand, did we create new jobs? Are we creating a positive socioeconomic impact? Were the dollars applied to the right projects? And so there'll be funding and tracking responsibilities that will go out. It's even stated in the Build America at build.gov. So all of those new responsibilities, right? Big new funding, big rise in project volume, and some expectations on reporting, tracking, and transparency, all while we have people retiring from our organizations or a flat out labor shortage, 650,000 unfilled jobs in the construction workforce. So what that does, and if you're looking at this yellow line that slopes up and to the right, sort of like an S-curve, you have increasing risk and uncertainty in your organization of how you're going to go execute this. And what all organizations have shared with us is that they've come to this place where they recognize that they need to implement a step gain in productivity in order to deliver all this work. And with that, they're going to need to develop ways to quickly adopt digital tools and to embrace digital transformation within their organization. And again, I'm going to map it back to Rick, because this isn't about us or me. This is about real organizations that have taken this step. Rick, I mean, I think it's almost like you already knew this was coming. I know it wasn't in the plan, but you took on a major, digital transformation effort, and now you're way ahead of the curve. Could you just, add your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, so clearly we didn't take on the digital transformation effort knowing that the bipartisan infrastructure law was coming. However, we've had a large capital improvement program, for years and years and years, right? And it was clearly evident that our old program management tools had lots of pain points, were monumentally inefficient, and at least with respect to this discussion, not particularly good at reporting and not auditable at all, right? So, what we've done with implementation of eBuilder is we now have our capital improvement program fully built out, well into the future. Clearly, we add projects when new project needs are identified. But I could tell you right now how much we are expecting to spend in the year 2028. Because of what we've built into the system. And relative to the point of this particular discussion, that makes it really easy for us when requirements come down for funding about certain project types that might be in serving certain communities or things like that. Because of how we've built out our system, we're very easily able to answer any of those questions, right? We can identify projects quickly that might meet a requirement. If there's a requirement we never thought about, we can update the system to be able to track that. And, you know, from a transparency, auditing, and reporting perspective, you know, yes, this program, you know, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will have some pretty significant reporting and auditing requirements. And to me, that's the easy part, because with what we've done already, it's just pulling information out of the system that already exists. And it's a challenge to get there, clearly. You know, I'm sure there are owners in varying steps of their e-builder journey on the call, some that may not have a project management information system at all yet, but you can get there. And when you do, it makes things like the challenges that an owner might face from the requirements of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law really quite easy to deal with. And now you only have to worry about the nuances of, you know, getting the funding. Dealing with the requirements of that funding become, you know, just a secondhand thought, right? It's easy to deal with. So if you have been proactive in that regard and have a program built out, I think great. That information to support your needs is going to be there for you. And if you haven't, you know, give these sorts of things thoughts when you are implementing a program, right? Think about the data that you might need to get out of that program to be able to support the needs of your organization, whatever those needs might be.
Rick, I'm gonna end this session with a question towards you, and it comes from the audience. I know you, both personally and professionally, are passionate about how the infrastructure law is going to help tackle the climate crisis. The question is this, and it comes from Dan. What project opportunities focused around environmental protection are you hoping your agency gets funded because of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law? Feel free to share as much as you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good question. We do lots of different sorts of projects, right? We're a wastewater agency. However, there's a lot to unpack there. We do a lot of energy projects. So hopefully we will see some of our energy projects get funded, you know, where we look to create more green energy at our water reclamation facilities. You know, I think one of the projects in our plan is to do some additional digestion of sludge for energy creation. We do a lot of green infrastructure, reducing, you know, runoff to our local rivers and streams. You know, so hopefully we'll see some funding in that regard, and just new technologies that are more energy efficient at our water reclamation facilities. You know, our primary treatment plant, Jones Island, is 100 years old. Clearly, not all the equipment is 100 years old, but you know, a lot of that technology has changed, right? And replacing some of those technologies is very expensive. You know, so we have across the gamut, right? Regardless of whether it be flood management, green infrastructure, energy, you know, wet or solids treatment processes. You know, I think we are looking forward to receiving funding for virtually any or all of our projects, because I think depending on your perspective, you know, we can find ways that would make virtually all of our projects be applicable to the program.
There you have it, folks. I'm going to remain true and faithful to my time commitment. We have some awesome sessions.